I was first invited to give this paper when I was working with the VCH in Shrewsbury, and I've been specifically looking at the guilds. At the time of joining, I just finished writing a book on the experience of work in early modern England down at Exeter University with Jane Whittle, Mark Halewood and my colleague Taylor Aucoin. And in the book, we look at gender division of labour and all the kind of hidden types of work that make up the day-to-day tasks of cooking, eating, cleaning, and within that we found women's work was often under-recorded, and in our book we tried to rectify that. So when I came to the guilds, I was really optimistic that I might also be able to do something about that with women's work, and so that's what kind of inspired the paper and the research that I've done, sort of looking at women's work within the guilds and also the ways in which the guilds regulated women's work and then how women circumnavigated that to earn an income on the peripheries of the guilds.
So this is very much a personal passion for you.
Yeah. It's been really exciting, and Shrewsbury has some fantastic records both for the guilds but also some really lovely detailed petitions, which are a fantastic resource at the archives here. They're not well catalogued, but the bundles and bundles of documents the archivists have been bringing up, just everyday life in all its form across all the social hierarchies are there in the petitions, and we get some really lovely descriptors of women's work within those. And also the quarter sessions, the depositions there, they have a wonderful catalogue here, and you can navigate them and search them by name, date and the type of work. And in that you'll find lots of women doing all sorts, from spinning and carding and brewing and selling ale, so they come into the paper as well.
So you delivered this lecture, a couple of months ago in autumn. Talk me through it then. Talk me through what you found out.
In the first instance, I was looking at the guilds. So ordinarily the type of language that we have around guilds, we're really common to hear about the brotherhood, fellowship, guildman, craftsman, and obviously it's all male oriented. But actually the guild regulations actually kind of touch the lives of women, and in those beautiful petitions that they have in Shrewsbury, there was one that really caught my eye. It's undated, but it's most likely in the early 1600s, and it's from a woman, Margaret Bow. She's the wife of John Bow, a skinner in Shrewsbury, and she's pleading to the bailiffs for her pardon and release from prison after she was detained for uttering words against the warden of the Fellowship of Tailors and Skinners. So we don't know exactly what she said against the wardens, but we do know that the ordinances of the Guild of Tailors and Skinners demanded good behaviour from their members. So the Combrothran of the Guild was to give any uncivil, unruly, disordered bad words to the reproach or discredit of the wardens, either before their faces or behind their backs. They would suffer a punishment. And so it's really interesting to see that the wife of the skinner here is imprisoned for doing something in breach of the ordinances. So it's quite clear that even though these guilds are exclusively protecting the craft work of men, it actually extends to the entire household. And here we have a woman imprisoned for breaching these rules and regulations.
What year was this?
We don't know. Early 1600s based. A lot of the petitions are undated, so you either have to go off the name of the bailiff in the petition and corroborate that with other records, or just from the bundle that it's in. We know some time in the early 1600s.
Is there any evidence that you've come across that suggests that women were treated any differently from men, given the kind of offence that you're talking about?
They're certainly not treated any more leniently. And that's something that's really interesting, because in the historiography there's this idealised view of the medieval artisan household, and Alice Clark very famously presented the guild system as being open to sisters and brothers, and this equal opportunities for work, and something she kind of termed as a golden age of women's work. But I mean, she was looking at records principally of London, and since then work by Laura Gowing and projects like our own on the forms of labour. We've really challenged that methodology, and we've used alternative records to piece together what women's work actually looked like. There's no more leniency for the women in these situations. There's plenty of petitions in there as well of men appealing to be let off for actions against their guild.
I was actually wondering the opposite, whether they might be treated more harshly. Who knows? But there we go. Okay. So what did you find out next?
So my research then began by looking specifically at the guilds' ordinances themselves. They're a really great place to start. And we have two types of records for the guilds. We have, on the one hand at Shrewsbury, we've got the ordinances. So these are the kind of rules and regulations as they should have been implemented. And then we have records of things like the apprenticeship books, and that tells us what actually happened in practice, and that's often contrary to the ordinance. So it's quite nice to marry those two together to get a full picture. And in the first instance, the weavers and clothiers in Shrewsbury have some really full records that date back right to their earliest ordinances. And as you can see in here, in the ordinances it stipulates that a woman shall occupy the trade of weaving for no more than 3 months after the death of her husband, so that she may finish the work she was doing before he died. So it's very interesting here. On the one hand, we have an idea that, yes, the wife of a weaver would very legitimately be doing work alongside her husband, weaving and producing cloth, but that once her husband dies, she can only continue that work for 3 months, and then she relinquishes her right. She cannot carry on in her husband's trade. And ordinarily we find widowhood is one of those really special life stages in which a woman might be able to enact more authority and economic independence, but the weavers and clothiers are very clear that that isn't the case, and after 3 months they have to relinquish the shop and all the apprentices that would have been operating under the husband.
So do we have any indication what might have happened to some of these women after they were widows?
Yeah, we have some really interesting cases in the first instance that suggest that the ordinances were drafted in response to too many women in the industry in the first instance. So records from the 1370s and 1380s, we have lots of women, well, not lots, but we've got at least 5 women who routinely appear buying wool from a merchant called John Presley, and they all identify and are listed as weavers. So we do know that women in the 14th century were filling some of these labour shortages that we might expect and we see in lots of other towns after the Black Death. And it seems that the ordinances drafted in 1468 in response to these women operating in this craft, and it's a means to exclude the women and to preserve the craft for the men. And actually, when we look at the apprenticeship books, most of the women do abide by this 3-month rule. So we do have some instances where we have newly widowed women who take on the apprentice of their deceased husband, but after 3 months the apprentice is rebound to somebody else, usually a male master. And we've got instances such as Robert Morgan. Robert Morgan was master. He died in July of 1614, and he was bound over to serve the remainder of his term with his master's widow, Alice ap Thomas, and she also took on Ellis, who was servant to her husband Robert Thomas, and she's listed as a dame when she's taking on these apprentices. But by the end of 1614, just outside the desired 3-month window, both of these servants and apprentices are rebound with a master within the guild called James Owen. So we do see that in the Guild of Weavers and Clothiers, the widows do appear to judge it. Apart from, we have some really lovely examples, as with all kind of you try to find patterns, and there's always the outliers. So we do have some instances in around the same time, so in 1612, 2 apprentices, Richard Bagnall and Daniel Porter, were both bound to serve the remainder of their apprentices with Alice Porter, who was a widow, and they stayed with her until 1618, serving nearly 6 years with her. Lucy Cotton, who was a widow, and she also took on her late husband's apprentices, 2 of them, and they stayed with her till 1618. And we have another 2, Simon Cleaver and George Sittons, who were both bound to serve the remainder of their terms with Jane Heaves in 1626, and they don't appear anywhere else in the books to be rebound. And we do have one instance of Elizabeth Duchess, who is a widow, and she appears paying 1 penny for the fine to employ her own journeyman. So here we have a woman employing people in presumably her own workshop. So there are some outliers who challenge those ordinances and seem to sustain a workshop in some form. Quite possibly these are outliers, and they continue because the apprentices that are under their care appear also to possibly be a male relation, and so in these instances there is a male head of household, and therefore they're able to sustain an apprenticeship until they become of age and take over the workshop.
So are they breaking the rules, or is the guild making an exception in these cases?
They're not necessarily breaking the rules. I think it's the instance that the son is vouching for the household, and he is fulfilling the term of his apprenticeship and will be the head of the household.
So they're accepting that as a substitute, basically?
Yes, in those instances, yeah. It's really important to note that these workshops are with children playing around and the husband perhaps doing the manual work. In these images we have the men making up the wooden frames, and we have women utilising smaller handheld tools for weaving on the frames, but also small handheld spindles. So working alongside the husband, but using a very different set of instruments, doing the fine needlework. The tools that the women use are smaller, they're cheaper, they're portable, and they're the type of things that can be put down and picked up again around other duties within the household as well.
These are beautiful illustrations that you're showing here. Where do they come from?
So some of these are illuminated manuscripts. So this is from the Holy Family at Work from the Hours of Catherine of Cleves. So these are sort of idealised images of the workshop. A lot of them are continental, but as you'll see later, we have some images from the Luttrell Psalter as well for some of these day-to-day work tasks of carding and spinning as well, which are more pertinent to England. So it's not just the weavers and clothiers that seek to exclude widows. The tailors and skinners also have a very similar policy in Shrewsbury. And what's really interesting is that from their ordinances, you would think that they might welcome women. In 1627, they have new regulations which refers to brothers, sisters, masters, mistresses, dames, and yet there are no female masters in the records, apart from those who are presented for breaking the regulations. And one really interesting case is that of the widow Mary Barch, and she's presented for maintaining and upholding George Evans to work at the trade of a tailor without the consent of the master wardens. And we also have a Robert Griffiths, who's fined for working unlawfully under a female widow. And finally, one case which really exemplifies this sort of pushing widows out of their own workshop, we have Elizabeth Hussey. She was presented and fined in 1629 and ordered not to set any man to work under her, contrary to the composition. But not only that, she was actually granted £8 and 4 shillings in respect of her poverty in charge of her children as a poor widow under the charitable obligations of the Guild. So the ordinances might refer to masters and mistresses and dames, but they actually seek to provide charity for widows on the condition that they're no longer allowed to operate a craft. And specifically, the Guild is designed to support and maintain the poor of the fellowship, decayed by age or by any other misfortune, to be pitied or lamented. And in this case, widowhood is one of those such states. And the tailors and the skinners operate quite swiftly to move widows to charity rather than continuing in the craft.
So they're almost offering them a pension of some kind, I suppose, in a way, yeah.
It's one of the really important sociable functions of guilds. They're there to provide charity for their members, to provide pensions, to help people when they're sick, to provide all the funeral rites. You know, they are a social institution, and widowhood comes under that remit of charity rather than continuing to uphold the workshop.
That gives us a clue as to what may have happened to some of the widows. I just wonder from your research whether you found out what happened generally to women who suddenly would, of course, have lost their means of earning an income. Their household would have changed dramatically with the death of their husband. What happened to these women? What did they do?
Well, we'll see about that a little bit later when we look at things like ale selling and women working on the peripheries of the guilds. But there are a few guilds in Shrewsbury where widows actually thrive. Comparatively. So one such is it's the mercers, ironmongers and goldsmiths. And they do have a history of having female apprentices and female masters. So if we go right back to the 15th century, we do see a small flurry of female apprentices within this guild. Eleanor Gosnell, Isabel Dudleston and Anne Dudleston. They're all apprenticed for 7 years into the household of prosperous merchants in the late 15th century. And in 1598, in the Mercers, we have a Mrs. Elizabeth Ockle taking on an apprentice. And it's really important to note, Laura Gowing found in her research that the prefix Mrs. doesn't necessarily indicate a marital status in the guild records, but rather it denotes mistress, and it's a title that signifies that she's an established woman of means, skilled manager of servants and apprentices. So Elizabeth Ockle here in the Guild Mercers, Ironsmiths and Goldsmiths, she's not actually a widow, she's a mistress in her occupation as a mercer. So we do see some women operating within the guilds, specifically within metalwork. And this is one of our only few instances where we have a woman with an occupational descriptor. In 1487, we've got Catherine Wilmot in the apprenticeship records taking on an apprentice, but she's actually defined not by her marital status, but by, which is a widow, as we know from other records, but by her occupation, and she's listed as a pewterer. So it's really rare that we see these occupational descriptors for women. So within the metalwork, within smithing, we do have women, and it's not uncommon. The VCH research over at Chester also found that there are a small number of widows operating as masters. They found 5 in total in Chester, But actually, when we look at the records of the Company of Smiths in Shrewsbury, the apprenticeship book shows that from 1622 to 1740, over 5% of all apprentices and journeymen actually went to female mistresses. So it's one of the few instances, I think, where we see women taking on apprentices, and not necessarily just through widowhood, but as misses.
So these restrictions differed from guild to guild, essentially?
Yes, every guild has its own set of ordinances and presumably its own approach to how they apply those ordinances and regulations.
So did the rules differ in Chester, or was it the same industries that people were involved with? Do we know?
I don't know specifically how the ordinances of the Smiths differ in Chester, but yeah, every guild is drafting its own individual ordinances and then applying those to the members of its own guild. And actually, over time, we see that women do start to become admitted as half-brothers in some industries by the 18th century.
So does this change over time? That was one of the questions I was going to ask.
Yes, definitely. So a lot of the records that we do have for the Mercers, we're very fortunate at Shrewsbury that they do have a really good set of records for the Mercers. And you see in the examples of our female apprentices, they are in the 15th century, as is Catherine Wilmot, who's a pewterer. She's in 1487. And then gradually we see more and more women entering into the records. And actually, by the sort of end of the records of the Company of the Smiths, we see that male apprentices actually are using a language of choice when they're picking female mistresses. So in 1723, we have a Joseph Barber, and he states in the record that of his own choice chooses to serve the remainder of his apprenticeship with widow Pearson. And in 1737, Thomas Corbett did make choice of the widow Sarah Denwell to serve the remainder of his apprentice. And what's really important in this case is that she's not a widow to his former master. There's no compulsion for him to have chosen Sarah Denwell, but actually he could have picked any master from the Smiths, but he chose to serve the remainder of his apprentice with a female mistress from the guild. The image that I have here is actually showing a female blacksmith at the anvil there, and there are a few images depicting women as blacksmiths. So I think this is one of the industries in which women did historically have a role, and they managed to sustain that here in Shrewsbury.
I'm quite surprised, I have to say, that blacksmithing is one of them, really, because it seems to be quite physical. Physical,
but also very intricate. And the type of work that women are doing, we might not have many women listed in the guilds of things like glovers, for instance, or in the shoemakers, but we know that really fine intricate stitch work was very often done by the wife, and we find lots of other records where maybe the wife of a shoemaker is sat in the workshop sewing. It doesn't say exactly what she's sewing, but presumably it would have been something related to her husband's trade, and it's possibly that fine stitch work you have finishing off garments on the upper soles of a shoe or on the edge of a glove. And same in smith work, there's a lot of fine intricate metal work, and women do manage to sustain a role there.
So this leads us on to the next part of your research, really, which is looking at the variety of different things that women did.
Yeah, so the guild records can only ever tell us one small bit of the picture. And in this case, a lot of what the guild records tells us is that women are largely excluded from craftwork in Shrewsbury. And so obviously, having just finished the book, I was really interested to see what work did women actually do then, and the type of records that we might look to that. And so the three areas I focused on were the areas attached to the wool industry, because Shrewsbury is famously, the wealth of it is built on wool and cloth, but actually it might well have been the male merchants who were accumulating wealth, but it was built upon the labours of women. So I've got lots of evidence about spinning, carding and sewing. It took me quite by surprise, but actually there was a little bit of evidence around candle making. It's not something I'd come across before, but just enough there to suggest that this is something women were doing. And then finally, I mean, you can't talk about women's work without talking about beer. And so there is some really rich evidence about making and selling ale.
So let's go back to the first part of that, which was, you were talking about, was it carding and sewing?
Yeah, carding, spinning and sewing. So we know that women are heavily involved in the production of cloth, maybe alongside their husband in kind of that artisan household. As we saw those images, idealised as they are, we do know that women were recognised as working there. But before we get to the stage of this weaving, there's a whole load of other work that needs to be done to get wool ready, principally carding and spinning. So here we have some images from the Luttrell Psalter, and you can see the carding, that kind of motion of, I'm sure everybody's seen it, these living in museums, of scratching out the wool and stretching the fibres, ready to go. And we have here also a handheld spindle where you have a weight at the bottom, and that just pulls, you tease out the threads from the top, and the spindle wall is the weight at the bottom, and that spins around and just stretches and twists the fibres at the bottom there. And we also have in the final image here a spinning wheel as well, where a woman's using that. Now, a lot of these instruments, particularly this handheld spindle and the instruments of carding, are movable, and we actually have in records depositions where women are arguing about who's borrowed their spindle wool and who's nicked this and who's that. But they do borrow and lend these instruments amongst each other, in these kind of small cottage industries. And it's principally in Shrewsbury, as lots of other places. It's supported by something we call a putting out system, where wool merchants buy unfinished wool in bulk, and then they sell it on a deferred payment, usually to women, who then take it home in bags. They card it, they spin it, and then they sell it back to the same wool merchant, and the difference in price is their salary. It's not very well paid, but it's a really important additional income. And there's a really lovely case in the Quarter Sessions from the Colham suburb of Shrewsbury, where we get lots of women describing exactly this system of putting out. The way we find out about a case in the Quarter Sessions is usually from the records of the depositions. And as I was saying earlier in the talk, that Shrewsbury has these fantastic depositions. And these are the recorded witness statements of the people involved in the case. And in this instance, we have a woman called Margaret Roberts, and she's accused of having stolen about a wax weight of black wool. And the bailiffs go into her home and they found, lo and behold, this small bundle of black wool. And then in the following examinations, they describe how that wool got there. So Margaret describes that she lived in the Colham area, outside the city walls, just south of the river. And she appears to have fallen on hard times. Her husband was a sawyer who lives by that company, and Margaret helped to make their living by the spinning and carding of wool at the rate of 2p a pound. But in the record, she says that her husband has left the home for some time and she's got no idea where he is. She cannot now tell, and she's living only by her means of spinning and carding. She claims that she gets most of her work from John Lewes, the Goodwife Cherwell, and Hugh Benson, all of whom lived close by in Colham. So these are the people who are buying the wool in bulk and selling it on to Margaret to finish. She also had in her home £7 of wool, £3 she claims to be from John Lewes, £4 from Hugh Benson, and along with the additional wax weight of black wool. Now, Margaret claims she had it off John Lewes' wife, and she says that she took it over a charge for work that had gone unpaid. John Lewes' wife says, absolutely not, it's been stolen, and that's where we get the court depositions from. Margaret Lewes, the victim whose yarn was stolen, she gives her an occupational description of spinster, and her husband, John Lewes, the Goodwife Joe, all appear to be distributing wool to be processed in the neighbouring households. And they all say that they operate in and around the style at Colham. So it's a really small local industry coming in and out of each other's homes, sort of moving wool around. Perhaps one point to note about the change over time here is that we have this industry around carding and spinning all in this small area. Earlier research by Diane Hutton, looking at women's work in Shrewsbury in the 14th century, found that carding was actually exclusively male and limited to somewhere called Carpenter Lane. But here we find that actually by the 17th century it's something that's being done by women on the edge of the town. So that's perhaps a slight shift in change over time there.
Do we know what happened to Margaret ap Roberts?
No. The thing with court sessions is you very often have these really lovely rich depositions. You very rarely actually find out what happens in the case. I mean, I suspect by the fact that the bailiff has gone into her home and found it tucked away that,
Probably some evidence there.
Yeah, she didn't have much of a leg to stand on. But really helpfully for us, she describes all the various people who she has got the wool from, and we can kind of piece together something there about women's work, carding and spinning. And we also have kind of other forms of work around the wool trade and cloth trade in Shrewsbury, one of which is sewing. So there's some kind of small nuggets of information pieced through the guild records. So, for instance, we've got in the Draper's book somebody called Catherine Soster. She's paying rent for a tenement owned by the Drapers Guild in 1505 as an independent young woman. And quite probably might infer from her name Soster that she makes a living by needlework. It's not too far a leap. And then later in the records we have apprenticeship indentures, and we actually have 2 young girls being apprenticed to seamstresses in Shrewsbury. 1689, Hannah Johnson was set apprentice to Mary Johnson, who's a seamstress. And in 1711, Elizabeth Simpson was set apprentice to Alan Higginson, who's a shoemaker, and Elizabeth, his wife, to learn the trade, art and mystery of seamstress. So we have exactly here that dynamic of Alan Higginson and his wife both working in a shoemaker craft household, but Elizabeth is identifying as a seamstress. So maybe she is performing that sewing work on the shoes, and here she's taking on an apprentice with her husband to learn that art of being a seamstress.
It's almost natural that you would expect that in a household, though, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's
totally.
a human thing.
Yeah, working side by side, especially when you think about, the workshop being that domestic space and working in and around each other. It is most likely you would pass tasks back and forth to finish off goods. And then one of my favourite records that I did find in my research, which would have been lovely to have gone in the book about women's work, was this really detailed description by a spinster, Joyce Clark, who was also examined in the quarter sessions with regards to a theft. And if I can read a little bit about her case, I think it really illustrates that kind of making a living that we so often use to describe women's work. It's small flurries of producing work, selling work, moving money around. And Joyce Clark is poor and she's travelling. And in her quarter session deposition, she gives us some really lovely details about what her work is like. So she actually starts her statement by saying that she's a sempster, which is a term used for those who sew, and we think of those usually as garments. And she claims that she hath some wear which she wrought with her needle. So she's sewn some items, possibly clothing or accessories, that she's then moving about with her to sell. And she describes travelling with her goods from one market to another to buy and sell, to get a penny to help maintain her. So it's that really small income. And she describes travelling on All Souls' Day in Bishop's Castle. Then she travels on to Wellington, where she stayed and drank in the inn of William Taylor. And then she travelled onward to Ludlow Fair to sell her goods before returning to Shrewsbury. And here she's lodging again at an inn at Montford Bridge. She then packs up her things again and she goes on to Oswestry Fair. So she's travelling between markets and fairs, selling the garments that she made. And actually what I find personally interesting for some of my own research is that she uses the cash that she's got at the market, and she actually lends 3 shillings to somebody at an inn who gave it back to her and more. So she's actually, with the money that she is making from selling, she's lending out that cash for interest as well on her way to and from the inns. So she's moving not only around the markets her own goods that she's sewn, but also perhaps a little bit of coin, and using that to make an additional income too. So she's got extra sources of revenue coming in. So buying and selling cloth, it's not uncommon for women, and some of the quarter session depositions that we have in the Shrewsbury archives actually describe women selling cloth and it going missing. So usually around theft, but we do find a lot of women buying and selling cloth in the Shrewsbury markets. And so just a final point to make about women's work in the wool trade is that we see some huge mercantile wealth being accumulated in Shrewsbury in this period, but actually it's based on the work of women, which is poorly paid. Margaret ap Roberts claims she earned just 2p for finishing a pound of wool, something which is akin to a day's work. And the sempster Joyce Clark labelled with her needle to get a penny. And we can compare this with a list we have here at Shrewsbury of the working rates, the pay expected in different industries. So a woman working as a reaper in the field would expect a daily wage of around 5p. And then if we compare this to men's salaries, a journeyman's daily wage at the time in Shrewsbury was set at 10p. A craftsman in a guild, so a joiner, bricklayer, sawyer, as some of the examples given, could earn up to 15p. So the women's work is underpaid, but is contributing to a really important industry for Shrewsbury at the time.
Candle making is another thing that you've mentioned, not a particularly, well, it's a rather smelly and nasty occupation, isn't it? What was going on there?
I wasn't expecting the candle making at all. In the guild records, actually, chandlers, candle makers, they joined the barber surgeons, and there's some dispute there, and eventually they all come under one. You don't usually find chandlers alongside barber surgeons. Usually they're with the mercer. So it's a little bit of a quirk of Shrewsbury's guild ordinances there. But actually, when I was looking through the records, it seems that women were making candles. As I mentioned earlier, the work of Diane Hutton, who was looking at women's work in the 14th century in Shrewsbury, she did find that women had listed in their movable goods in some of the records. She looked at candles and tallow, which is the raw ingredient for making candles. And so when I was looking through the petitions, those lovely uncatalogued huge bundles, I did come across a petition that was presented by the wardens of the Chandlers in 1584, and it lists a number of women that were presented who were in breach of the ordinances set out by the guild, and they were investigated for the profit of the town. And the petition presented an individual called Hugh Vane for selling a quarter of a tallow to Thomas Clack's wife and the daughter of William Press. So he's presented for selling illicitly tallow to women. And presumably that's because they're going to go on and make and sell candles. In the same petition, Margaret Card was found guilty of selling a pound of candles, and the widow Eleanor Jones a pound of little candles, and her daughter the same again in the streets of Shrewsbury on the 23rd of November 1584. So one small petition tells us something about women's work in this area, that they are making and selling candles. One petition that doesn't necessarily come under the remit of Shrewsbury, but it was so beautiful and so detailed, it was very hard to ignore. It's a petition by Margaret Plummer of Ludlow, and she actually writes to the bailiffs of Ludlow for a special dispensation to carry on her husband's craft after his death as a tallow chandler. And in her really detailed petition, she describes the circumstances. She says that her husband was one of only 2 men in the town of Ludlow who served an apprenticeship in the trade of tallow chandler, and that he had performed this craft up until his death. And Margaret Plummer claims that upon his death, she'd taken up the profession herself without disturbance until of late. So presumably she's been going along about it just fine, and then somebody's made a complaint. But now she finds herself presented to the bailiffs of the town for not having secured 7 years' apprenticeship. So questioning whether she has the skills and the admittance of the guild to be performing this craft. She was indicted and she was fined 1 shilling, which she paid. But it's not the only trade in the household since her husband's death. And Margaret describes her son, who was an apprentice in the trade of brazier and pewterer, which he practised alongside his father. So in her petition, Margaret implores the bailiffs, according to an ancient and laudable custom in this town, time out of mind, to grant her a licence for following the employment of a tallow chandler, she in all things behaving herself according to the laws of such licence. She also testifies to her poverty and charge of care in the household, saying that she has 2 grandchildren under her roof to provide for, and she has no other way of subsistence. So here we have Margaret appealing to continue her husband's trade as a tallow chandler, and really importantly, she's utilising this really well-known refrain of ancient and laudable custom, time out of mind, to suggest that this is something she's entitled to do, and to suggest that the customs of the town historically would have allowed her to do this. And yeah, she's also inciting this really good behaviour, and that she's been going along just fine, and also noting that if she's not providing the candles, there's only 1 of 2, the town would be in a shortage. So she's really appealing to all elements of the bailiff: poverty, grandchildren, and also my son is here and is going to be head of household once he has finished his apprenticeship.
She's prepared a very strong case, hasn't she? She's made a long
has.
list of things, both emotional, practical, all of those different things, really, to make a case. But really illustrative, isn't it, of the situation that she found herself in? Yeah,
so it's something that I wasn't expecting, and just a small number of cases relating to candle making. But it does seem that this is something that women are taking on, and that they are doing both illicitly and seeking licence to continue doing so with the approval of the bailiff. So yeah, candle making appears to be one of those areas of women's work that I hadn't seen before, and it was really lovely to get to grips with a different industry.
Yeah, it'd be good to get on to one of my favourite subjects, which is beer and ale selling.
Ale selling in Shrewsbury, and perhaps staying with Ludlow for a second or 2 longer. We have these lovely misery cords in the church at Ludlow here, and they're these carvings on the underside of hinged seats. And here at Ludlow, we've got this fantastic one of a female ale seller, and she's being carted off to the Hellmouth, we have a devil reading out a list of all of her indiscretions, quite possibly the usual accusations of female ale sellers for using bad grain and bad wheat, and for not selling according to the right weights and measures and shortchanging her customers. And she's also disgraced by being naked from the bottom down as she's sort of thrust over the back of this beast, devil-like beast, before she's been thrust into the Hellmouth. So female ale sellers are very prominent and always have been in medieval England, and this misery cord here at Ludlow is just a really lovely local depiction of the typical female ale seller. So where do we find evidence of women selling ale in Shrewsbury? And that shifts when we look at medieval records through to the early modern. So for the medieval period, we're dependent on presentments in the court baron, and later those presentments appear in the quarter sessions. Now, ale sellers are presented for not adhering to the right weights and measures, for selling without a licence, for watering down their ale, for a number of offences, and then they're presented before the bailiffs of the town in the court baron, or before the JPs in the quarter sessions. And they're presented by the market official in the first instance, who is going around checking on the weights and measures in the marketplace. You can see he has an L stick in his hand, that's for measuring the cloth, and he has a purse here for collecting fines, and it's not quite clear, but on his back he holds a tankard there with the right measurements in there to go and check the measures that are being served by the ale sellers. And so when I came to do this research, I wanted to produce one of these lovely charts that shows the rise and decline of female ale sellers. And I was really ambitious. I went in and called up these enormous rolls in the archives from the court baron to get an idea of medieval female ale sellers. There was only one roll from the 1400s that really had this long list with the names of all those presented. And what I've done is I've produced a chart here that shows the percentage of those presented who were women over time. And you can see quite clearly this is the exact sort of pattern that we see across most towns in England at this time. So we start from the 1400s, around 76% of all those presented for selling ale were women, and then that drops dramatically. The next record we have is in 1595 in the presentments for the quarter sessions, and what I've done is I've taken averages and condensed them down into sort of, as best I can, every decade, to show that after this huge presentment in 1400 of 76%, all of a sudden women decline to somewhere consistent around 15 to peaking at 25%. So women are being excluded from selling ale. Now, Shrewsbury does have a guild for ale sellers, the vintners, and they have ordinances in the 15th century, but then we don't hear from them again. I mean, they cease to exist. So it's on the peripheries of guild regulation.
So obviously the pattern changes over time. Does the profile of the female sellers also change over time?
Yeah, so in the first instance, sort of in the 1400s, Diane Hutton again did some research on this, where she found that most of those selling ale were widows, and they were widows of craftsmen and journeymen. So from sort of those artisanal households, it was an additional income, and most commonly ale was brewed in the home by women. And Diane Hutton does reference this rather gruesome coroner's report that's in the Shrewsbury archives as well, Agnes of Hagman, who appears in the records in 1296, and she's exactly the typical ale seller. She's brewing in her home, and it just gives an idea of the quantity that women are brewing in their home, because she was carrying a tub full of hot liquor to a large vat in order to brew, but unfortunately she actually falls in the vat, and she sustained burns, and that led to a death 5 days later, which is where we learn of it in the coroner's cause. But she was brewing to such a large quantity that it was a vat large enough to hold her body. So it's a large amount of ale being produced within the home, so commercial brewing. Rather gruesomely, after her death, the ale from the vat was actually sold. She died in to raise a profit of 2.5 pence for the crown. And then what we see is that...
Can you imagine?
No.
Goodness me.
It's rather disgusting.
Isn't it just? Oh, goodness. Okay.
In the 17th century, women appear to make up a steady number of those presented for ale selling. So, like I said, around that 15 to 20%. But what we do see in the 17th century, this changes a little bit. We obviously have a huge decline in the percentage of ale sellers who are women. There's some interesting geographical breakdowns. So the later presentments, we can pick out the street on which the women were presented for. So some areas appear to have more women. St John Hills and Mardle Lane, 55% of those who were presented in those areas were women. And actually in 1646 we find a group of women called the Three Sisters who were presented for ale selling, so presumably running some sort of inn as three sisters there. And we also have some repeat offenders. Elizabeth Trevenant and Sarah Horton appear in 1610, 1611 and again in 1614. So they're being fined, but it's not enough of a deterrent to put them off. They're still selling. There are some lists of maltsters as well who are preparing the malt for brewing, and these are typically men, and we only have one female maltster in 1687. So women we see are selling ale but doing less of the brewing over time. And what we have in Shrewsbury as well is we have alongside those presentments for breaking the assize of bread and ale and for selling the ale, lists of licensed ale sellers. And these are really interesting because rarely do we have widows, female widows in these lists. What we do have are a lot of men. Women make up around 10 or 20% of those listed ale sellers, but they are married women. So it becomes increasingly that running an inn or a tavern is something that's done by women who are married to their husband, and they're doing it as a partnership. And we have one case in the records, a petition, that hints at this partnership, where we have a chap called Arthur Shearer, and he was presented for selling ale against the conditions of his licence. He travelled to London, where he was setting his son as an apprentice in the city, and in his absence it was his wife who continued to run the inn in Abbey Foregate of Shrewsbury. And this isn't the first time they've been presented for doing this, and he claims that he's poor, old and unable to work in his trade any longer as a craftsman, and he's turned to selling ale in his old age, and in order to continue running the inn, and in leaves of absence he leaves it to his wife. So we see more married women operating established inns, and we see more widows and the poor selling ale on the peripheries of the marketplace. And so we're getting lots of really complicated gender divisions and different types of ale selling according to place in the life cycle. And we've got some really great examinations of two women which can really illustrate those cases. We talked a little bit about the area of Colham before, and just by chance there's a dispute in Colham which generates a big batch of court session depositions against Anne Everell, and she's presented to the bailiffs for lewd and ill behaviour as a common disruption to her neighbours. She's accused of running a common alehouse or tippling house, and she serves many tipples and drinks in her house on Sabbath day, which she definitely shouldn't be doing, which goes against the statute for selling ale, where it explicitly says that no alehouses are supposed to be serving on the Sabbath. But it was actually her coarse words that got her into trouble with her neighbours. She calls one of her customers, Joyce Tipton, a drunken queen, and refused her any more drink and sent her home. She also called the servant, Jane Everans, a drunken queen. It seems to be her favourite insult, but she also implies that she's sleeping with her mistress. Mary Davis was called a drunken, and Elizabeth Yeach, a drunken Samhain queen. And she also claimed that Elizabeth was empty-bellied from her husband and came home full-bellied, and she finished a round of insults by holding up two of her fingers in the proportion of horns at Elizabeth's husband, common sign for cuckold. So clearly Anne mocking his manhood here. Anne is a widow, and she's actually running a licensed alehouse on her own, something which the presentment suggests was a rarity. But she's continuing to work selling ale in an industry that's increasingly dominated by men, even though she's doing it with limited regard for her customers. But she's a very vibrant character for sure. Exactly.
You can almost imagine the personality, can't you? She'd have needed to be tough.
Yes.
And she was tough by the looks of it.
Yeah, definitely. And then if we're thinking about all of these kind of unlicensed ale sellers who are selling in the marketplace, you know, from what you imagine, sort of the old-fashioned sort of stalls, we have one fantastic case, again from the lovely petitions at Shrewsbury in 1631, where we have the widow Marjorie Hamlet, and she's presented before the bailiffs for selling ale without licence to do so. Appealing to the gentler nature of the bailiff, she claimed, a poor creature of 90 years, or thereabouts, and she was unable to travel in person to appear before the bailiffs to defend herself. But we actually find that Marjorie did make her way into Shrewsbury that day, and she stood outside the court, but not to appear on the charge of selling ale without a licence, But in spite of what she claims was her poor health, age and infirmity, she actually stands outside and sells ale to the very officers who were there to decide her fate. This was her usual patch, and the officers of the court were her regulars. And in the petition, the bailiffs write a response that says, "We cannot be without her service, she being thereby occasioned for supplying our necessities." So they were actually very understanding that she failed to appear before them in person, as she couldn't possibly be expected to strain herself to do more in her trade of life than otherwise she would do or heretofore hath done. So they're very understanding, and they all go out and have a drink with her. And the outcome of her petition, the bailiffs proclaimed their special desire on account of her being a poor aged woman without other means to maintain herself, and being so necessary a help to us, that during the times of the meetings of the bailiffs, they would be pleased to tolerate her, as has been the wont of other bailiffs.
So necessary a help to us. I love that phrase.
Exactly.
So basically, they're her customers.
Yes, yeah. And I love that she has the cheek on the day that she's supposed to be appearing
selling.
before them. She just comes along and does her usual business.
To make the point.
Yeah, a roaring trade. So what we do find here is that female ale sellers, they can be tolerated. And in this instance, the bailiffs are actually turning a blind eye to those who are selling ale without a licence when it's to the benefit of themselves or the town. And perhaps we need to think about, in a time where ale sellers could be mistrusted or treated with suspicion. We've got all that imagery of the hellmouth and everything that we had earlier on. And also at a time when widows are often relying on rates from the parish to sustain them in their poverty, a trusted and reliable ale seller supporting themselves might be the preferred outcome, so that they're tolerating some of this as well. So over the period, we do see a marked decline in female ale sellers in the presentments, and this has been explained as men operating in the trade and obtaining official licences. But I think we can also see from some of these little case studies that women's work just simply goes under the radar. Men may have obtained the licence, but women, more often than not, were the ones doing the work in an alehouse and breaking quite blatantly the rules and regulations as well.
Can I just ask, because it sounds as if it's a familiar picture from elsewhere, from your other studies as well, why was it that women were so attracted to selling ale? Have you got any clues as to why that was?
I think it's something that can be done at home, and most women would have been brewing ale for their own consumption in the home, and then it's an opportunity to generate additional income from surplus.
So you'd be doing it anyway?
They'd be doing it anyway in the home, and then over time, the licensing system excludes them from something that they would have been doing. It is something that we look in our book on the experience of work, and when we look at the locations of work and the marital status of women, actually we find that a lot of the work in an alehouse is done by the married woman of the inn holder. So whilst they might not have the licence, they're very often the one providing food, providing drink, and also providing a place of economic exchange. So a lot of these married women are also creditors, or they're dealing in second-hand goods. It's a real, in especially rural communities, it's a point of, or a node in sort of a wider nexus of commerce and trade, and married women perform a really important function within that in the inn as well.
So they're supporting the economic activity, aren't they, essentially?
Yeah.
That's what's happening here. Yeah. From these studies, have there been any surprises? What sorts of conclusions have you drawn?
So I think when I first started out on this paper, I was just really eager to see what type of work women were doing in Shrewsbury, particularly having spent so much time with the guild regulations and the ordinances and the apprenticeship books. I was very aware that women were being excluded from a lot of work. It was really nice to spend some time thinking about what work they did do. And as I said, the candle making was a complete surprise, as was some of the work around the smithing. The petitions as well, women's ability to present themselves. Our unlicensed ale seller, Marjorie Hamlet, who's presented before the bailiff, she puts the case forward to continue her work, even though she is supposedly in her 90s. So it's really nice to be able to utilise new material. The petitions at Shrewsbury are very, very rich, and they've been an excellent source of sort of challenging what we might think of as, the expected work of women, or if you were just going off the guild ordinances, we might think women weren't operating in these trades. But having those petitions there sort of shows us how women's work was sort of operating on the peripheries of the guilds. In some ways it's frustrating. There's no clear story of change for women's work, but simply that women appear to be making a living, and they are doing that through lots of makeshift work. And that might be, you know, they haven't got an affiliation to a guild, but they have the ability and the skills to contribute within the artisan household, to sell surplus in the form of ale, or to be doing that sort of ad hoc work of carding and spinning within the home as well. So it's been really lovely to kind of piece together that makeshift economy of women's work.